Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 49 of the Eat for Endurance podcast. I am your host, Claire Shorenstein, and I know it's been a while once again. I think it's been about 5 months since my last episode. I keep saying I'm not going to be this sporadic with my episodes, but here we are once again. But I am back, and I know many of you have reached out, asked me when I'm going to be releasing episodes again. And I apologize, but here I am. I'm here now. I have finally scheduled some interviews in the upcoming months. I think I have a few on the books. So please just bear with me as I get some guests on the show, or at least attempt to. It's been a little bit more slow going getting people on the calendar, especially over the summer with everybody's schedules, but I am working on it. I'm also in the process of hopefully putting out a little mini series of, I think I'm going to do some sports nutrition basics, short podcast episodes with yours truly. If that sounds interesting to you, let me know. Or if you have any other topics that you'd like me to cover on my own, shoot me an email. You know how to reach me, eatforendurance@gmail.com. So today, it's another Ask Me Anything. It's been a while since I've done one of these. I kind of sprinkle them throughout here and there in between all of my other interviews, but I do collect questions. I think this time I've collected questions over about 6 months, so I'm finally answering them. My apologies to people who submitted back in April who needed more timely responses. I am finally getting to your questions today. But before I do all of that, since it's been a while, let's do a little catching up. A few things have happened since I last produced an episode back in March. Firstly, thank you all for your wonderful feedback on my nutrition story. I put that out back in March, made myself a little vulnerable, walked into this little closet and just kind of talked for, I wasn't even keeping track, just kind of saw what would spill out of my mouth, and I really enjoyed putting out that episode, and it seems like it resonated with many of you. So thank you all for the feedback you gave me and the support. I really, really appreciated that. That's that. Second, couple things I've enjoyed lately. None of you asked for this, but I'm giving it to you anyways. I finally read the book, or I guess more specifically, listened to the book What Made Maddie Run by Kate Fagan. It's an old one. I'm sure many of you have read it already, but it was so good. And even though I was never a college athlete, um, it really just so much of it resonated with me, what Kate Fagan wrote in there and the struggles that Maddie went through. I was never suicidal. I had my own struggles. Thank God I was never, it was never to that extreme, but much of what she wrote, it was just so powerful, and I highly recommend that book if you haven't read it already. I actually listened to it while gardening and running and doing a number of other things and really enjoyed it. The other thing I am quite obsessed with at the moment, I would say, and again, maybe some of you have already binged this, but I am into a very extreme binge of the Formula One series on Netflix. I think it's, what is it called? The Drive to Survive. It is really good. I have literally never watched any racing show or racing anything of any kind. I haven't seen a race on TV. I don't follow it. I am just so out of that sport. And I am obsessed with the show and so interested in motorsport now. I find it fascinating. And just from a nutrition's perspective, I mean, the amount of weight they lose and sweat, the amount they have to train. I mean, you don't think about it, but they have to train so heavily for what they do. I find it really interesting. And an upcoming guest of mine actually has some connection to the Formula One world, so I'm really looking forward to exploring some of that. Great show if you're looking for something to watch. And then lastly, on another note, I guess this was back in May, so again, it's been a while since I've updated you all, but I finally sat for and passed my board certification for sports nutrition. So I've, of course, been practicing as a sports dietitian for many, many years, and I've been meaning to take this exam for a really long time. So I just finally forced myself to do it, without much studying, actually. I crammed for a couple days. But it's a really hard, really long, big exam, the CSSD exam. And so I finally took it. I passed. So that was a really exciting thing that was on my bucket list that I'm just really happy about. Get that out of the way. Got my continuing ed credits for the next 5 years taken care of. So that's the other development, that I can officially call myself now a board certified sports dietitian. And yeah, so just sharing that good news, although I did post about it. So that's really the latest developments on my end. I'm also actually, oh yeah, I just forgot that I'm running a 50K in a few days. Actually, it's my first 50K since 2015. I'd say loosely training for that because I sheepishly admit that my biggest volume week was 36 miles. One of those runs was 20 miles. And so I've been very much low volume training over here. But no, I'm excited. It'll be fun. It's in the Marin Headlands. Um, Hopefully, third time's a charm, since the first time we tried to run a 50K out here, we moved. And then the second time, we all got really sick. So that was, oh yeah, that also happened since I last did a podcast. That was back in May. We missed our race. And so, yeah, so here's to hoping this one goes well and we make it to the start line finally and make it to the finish too. I will be, of course, updating you on that. All right, so let's get to today's questions. So, again, this is a mix of questions I've received between April and as late as like 30 minutes ago. So, let's take a look. My first question: any thoughts on eating intuitively for athletes versus a macro specific approach? I like the control I feel with macros, but often feels it goes against the grain of my body. Yeah, I hear you there. I get so many people who are macro counting or have done that in the past. Structure, numbers, counting, and tracking things. I mean, all of that can be really comforting for people who seek more control over their diet. Or maybe that's been prescribed by their trainer or whoever. They come up for it, with them or themselves. But this approach is at times really stressful. It's exhausting. Maybe it's even triggering. It also can lead you really to disconnect from your body's signals, not to mention make your life a bit miserable, at least in my opinion. It doesn't sound fun to me to always be tracking stuff. We also see this a lot in people who have disordered eating or eating disorders, just this seeking control and just like meticulously tracking every little thing, getting really stressed out if their numbers aren't right. I just don't find this is a good place for most people to be. That said, there's a time and a place for numbers. So I'm not saying we ignore numbers completely. Obviously, we don't. We need to keep our nutrition needs in mind. It's helpful to kind of identify some targets. I like to function in ranges, not just exact numbers. And when I work with clients, then we calculate out ranges and macros based on weight and physical activity levels, in addition to other things going on for that person. And we discuss ways to eyeball meals and snacks to attain these goals. So in my mind, education is really key here. We're not just like throwing out a macronutrient and having you track calories and all the different numbers. Like, my goal for people always is to give you the education you need to be able to go out in the world and do things on your own, right? That's always the goal. And my hope is that you're not always going to live your life attached to your phone or wherever you're tracking things, like inputting every single thing that's going into your mouth. That just, again, sounds absolutely miserable. So when I do use tools like, whatever, it's MyFitnessPal or whatever else, I mean, really it's only to spot check things. Like, maybe we're just getting a sense of what is your baseline. Like, so if we determine, oh, this is your range for protein or whatever it is, what's your baseline right now? Why don't you try going on one of these apps and just log things and see what comes out? Kind of noting that a lot of the times these things are not exactly 100% accurate, of course. But we're using it just to kind of get a baseline, right? But really, from day to day, and what we're looking at for long-term use here is, focusing on visual cues. We're making sure you understand what foods give you which macros and approximate servings and how to get there. For example, like a unit, what I call a unit of carbs, it's around 15 grams. If you have a slice of bread or a small piece of fruit, a serving of dairy, half a cup of cooked grains, etc., you get roughly that amount, give or take 5 grams or so. So, like, if we then know that you need, this range of carbohydrates, which we can calculate based on your weight and your activity level and your goals, right? If we need this amount, we divide it by 15. Oh, okay, so you're going to have, 3 to 5 servings or units in your breakfast and this amount of snacks or whatever it is, like we can kind of divide things up and you can look at your plate and be like, great, so I have 2 pieces of bread, I have a banana, I have this, this food gives me carbs, etc. So kind of doing this very rough ballpark estimating, knowing that this is roughly a unit. This food is rich in carbs. Just having that real like kind of basic understanding of what foods give you which macronutrients, et cetera, and what your needs are. That's kind of how I function with like loosely trying to attain these numbers, but without like obsessing about it, right? And for protein, you really need to understand like which foods are rich in protein. You need to know that there's a difference between, say, having 2 eggs, which, what is that, like 12 to 14 grams of protein versus like 5 ounces of chicken breast, which is obviously a lot higher, or a cup of beans, or 3/4 cup of Greek yogurt, or whatever it is. And again, not to be too obsessive about it, not to be overanalyzing everything, but you can get just like a general understanding of foods and kind of then roughly put together these meals of, oh, great, okay, I have a really good protein source. Oh, here are my roughly 3 units of a carbohydrate, and I'm throwing some vegetables in there and making sure there's a fat present, and yeah, you're not hitting like really specific percentages of whatever your these macronutrients targets are, but you can kind of eyeball it to roughly get there and feel good, right? Now, if you're like an ultra, a real elite athlete and have to be really specific, like maybe we're going about things a bit differently, but I'm saying for the average person here, this is adequate. You don't need to be more obsessive than this. I think something like this would work. So yeah. And then the last thing to keep in mind when you're having these like macronutrient percentages, like what is that based on? What is the total calorie amount? Where's that coming from? Did you get a resting metabolic rate test? Is there some testing that we can look to? Or was this kind of plucked out of thin air or out of equation that, from an equation that may or may not be accurate? So that's just another thing to keep in mind. All right, moving onwards. This is one of my really old questions. I'm a 52-year-old type 2 diabetic runner. What are some suggestions for fueling my workouts without spiking my blood sugar? I don't eat bread, rice, or pasta. I do consume fruits, vegetables, nuts, dairy, chicken, and fish and shellfish. All right, this is a kind of big topic. Actually, a lot of these questions I got are pretty huge, so I'll just do my best. But, first things, if you're diabetic, there's no need to cut out bread, rice, and pasta unless you do not like to eat these foods or have some other reason for avoiding them. If it's strictly for blood sugar control, it's more about portion control and balance of that meal or snack. For instance, you could choose a slice of a whole grain bread, which has a little protein. It has some fiber and other things. You can add some peanut or almond butter for healthy fats, protein, and fiber, and then add some fruit like a banana on top. And this is, of course, like one of the most extremely popular pre-run snack, or just general snack for many, right? And it's a really well-balanced, delicious combo that includes bread in a healthy way. Equally, you could choose brown rice or whole grain or legume-based pastas to add more nutrients, including fiber, and in the latter case, protein as well. But obviously, that's your choice. If you just don't want to eat those foods, I never question if people are wanting to cut them out. I just wanted to throw that out there to make sure that people aren't cutting those things out because they feel like they can't eat them. You certainly can. So that said, some people are sensitive to fiber and don't want to include too much pre-run. So that is something to keep in mind there if you're just going for these like whole grain, high fiber sources of things, right? But the key here is that carbs are giving us energy. And even as a diabetic, you're burning sugars in your blood from the foods you eat and potentially breaking them down from elsewhere for energy, your glycogen stores, and you're using them. In exercise, you are using those sugars for fuel. So we don't want to obviously avoid carbohydrates. We need to include carbohydrates pre and during exercise and post-exercise. And it's okay if these include some simple carbohydrates, as these are easy to digest and they're giving us what we need. That said, we can still, as I indicated in that other example, we can include a small amount of protein, like 8 to 10 grams or so. That's roughly what you get from, a couple spoons of a nut butter. And adding those other macronutrients like the fat and the protein, it does help reduce that blood sugar spike, as you say, right? You could have a low-fat Greek yogurt with fruit or high-protein waffle or pancakes or just so many other things that include some protein, a little bit of fat to make it so you're not just consuming carbohydrate. And even for non-diabetics, this is the recommendation to have, a good amount of carbohydrate with a smaller amount of protein. So what the real details of what you're having, that really then comes down to individual preference and tolerance and how much time you have and what kind of run you're doing, etc. Right? So the rest of that I'm not going to answer, but I just wanted to throw that out there. Okay? So hopefully that is a helpful start to answering your question. All right, next question. My head is spinning lately regarding the science of whether to run fasted or to eat a small snack beforehand. I'm an endurance runner and run most of my runs fasted. I typically only eat prior to my long run on the weekends, and that lasts 3 hours or more. But even my easiest runs during the week last at least 60 minutes, and I do some speed work and a middle of the week run that lasts nearly 2 hours. I've been struggling with some recent weight gain despite keeping my diet the same and exercise levels high. So I'm looking for anything I could adjust to address this. I'm thinking a lot of endurance athletes have questions about whether there are really benefits to fasted aerobic exercise. All right, good topic. Fasting and exercise, definitely a common question I get. I'll just go out to say, like, when we talk about fasting, obviously we're not just talking about carbs, but I am going to focus a little bit in answering this question about carb availability. Just because it's well established that carb availability improves performance, and there really currently is no strong research to suggest that fasting or training without carbs available improves performance. And I know that this question is a bit more about, well, somewhat about weight gain and weight. I'm going to focus a little bit more on performance because, I'll just go ahead with my answer. But I think that it's the more important aspect of this is what are the consequences or the lost opportunities to training fasted, essentially. And that does down the line impact weight. That's what I'm trying to say. So on a more practical note, I mean, there are a few ways to think about this. So first, if you think about achieving the most out of your training and optimizing your performance for an event or even just everyday activities, you are less likely to get there through regular fasting. And this is for a few reasons. So number one, we need to make sure that you have adequate energy availability, meaning that the amount of calories you take in throughout the day accounts for both what your body needs to stay alive and digest, move around and exercise, etc., or move around outside of exercise, I meant, and account for the energy cost of intentional exercise. So if you're chronically underfueling, meaning you have low energy availability, that leads to a whole host of physiological issues. So, including increased risk for injury and illness, which obviously will not help any of your goals, right? Second, certain nutrition recommendations we make, for instance, with protein, do not support going long periods of time without intake, especially for endurance athletes who, of course, have higher protein requirements. So instead, we're recommending, more moderate intake more frequently, say every 3 to 5 hours. And if you're fasting, you may be missing one or more of these eating opportunities. And that either makes it harder to consume enough in total, so thus increasing your chances of underfueling, or maybe it's making it harder to hit your protein goals in the recommended way, right? Another reason, third, you are compromising your performance on a day-to-day level, which in turn impacts your greater fitness adaptations and performance on race day. So maybe you're not training for an event, but you still want to make fitness gains. So that's relevant in that sense. We know that performance is enhanced, especially for longer and harder workouts, which rely more greatly on carbs for fuel, when carbohydrates are consumed prior to enduring enduring it in some cases. So that really depends on the duration of what you're doing, right? And if you're exercise fasted, that essentially means you're exercising with low carbohydrate availability. And if you do this consistently, you are reducing your ability to perform at high exercise intensities because it has been shown that this reduces overall ability to use muscle glycogen. And it also may lead to increased risk of illness since, unfortunately, your immune system is also suppressed. Also, you may lose muscle mass because when no carbs are available, what does your body do? You have increased muscle protein breakdown for fuel use. If weight is concerned, you do not want to be losing lean body mass, and really, you don't really ever want to be losing lean body mass. So those are just some of the concerns and consequences that we think about when it comes to fasted runs and specifically low carbohydrate availability, which is essentially what we're talking about when we talk about fasting. So this really is a bigger topic, but suffice to say that there are times when fasted running is fine. Like, let's say it's early in the morning and you're doing something short and easy, but would you perform better and feel better after if you had a small snack, like, as I was just talking about, some carbs with a little protein? Probably. Or maybe you'd only notice this when you're doing like a harder or longer session. I often have my clients, work on eating even before easy runs, and they don't always notice the difference. But again, I kind of frame it in that thought of, okay, well, this is an eating opportunity. You're struggling to get in enough calories to meet your total needs, or you're struggling to get your protein, or you have this crazy work schedule. Let's take advantage of this time, right? So there are lots of ways we can think about it. Now, if you want to continue to experiment with some fasted running, that's of course your choice. I would just choose less key workouts that are not super long and they're not intense, so not key workouts. And do them first thing in the morning after an overnight fast. But it's really important to prioritize recovery, especially post run, to make sure you're getting in the nutrition you need. All right, hope that helped answer your question. All right, next question. Would love to learn about maintenance fueling, everyday nutrition when the load is less. All right, this question is very broad, so I almost didn't include it, but I would say that, if you're in between training cycles, which to be honest, most people right now, it's August, you're probably not, you're probably full on training for your fall races. But for when you finish and your overall training volume does go down, yes, of course, we need to adjust our eating. And I'd say a part of this happens naturally. Maybe appetite falls off after a couple weeks as our exercise adjusts to a lower level. But for many people, and especially those who have gotten in the habit of eating a lot more, there has to be a little bit more intention surrounding your dietary choices. And I do hear this from people. They're like, oh, I'm not marathon training anymore, but I'm still eating like I am, right? So we do have to bring a little bit more intention to our food choices. So I guess the first thing we look at is, what is your current exercise load, right? Maybe you took a week off and you're just going right back at it. Then maybe we're not adjusting too much. Or maybe you took some time off and you're doing a different sport or doing something else, but you are still active. So it's not like we're completely cutting out everything and reducing everything. Like, we have to take stock of, like, okay, well, what are you doing? Are you still running a certain number of miles? Are you still doing whatever sport you're doing? So keeping that in mind is really important. I would say if you're exercising less, then yeah, your total energy needs do drop, right? Your carb needs likely drop as well, since you're not exercising as much. Protein needs may or may not drop slightly, really depending on what your goals are, what you're doing. And probably you can't get away with quite as much of the extra fun eating without weight gain. And again, that's a very individual thing. But if you're less active, yeah, you might notice that if you're just eating whatever you want all the time with no regard for anything, like, you may gain weight. So, my approach is really to continue the same foundation of healthy, balanced eating that we do during training, because that should be the foundation of everything, right? But maybe your plate has shifted slightly to include slightly more non-starchy veggies, reducing the starchy things slightly, or maybe you're more mindful of your portions when it comes to all the extras like dessert. You're not going crazy with the alcohol, which you never should anyways, but but I'd say overall, there shouldn't be like a massive change. You just have to be a little bit more mindful, a little bit more intentional, and ideally more in tune with what your body wants, right? But I never advocate for a restrictive approach to anything. So I'm not going to be like, no, you can't have dessert, you're not marathon training. Like, hell no, right? Anywho, okay, next up. Fueling for the athlete who runs first thing early in the morning. Carb up before bed, carb up after, or something else entirely. All right, this is a highly individual one. So first, it really depends what your tolerance is like. Can you eat something like toast or a banana and run soon after? Or do you need time to digest? Or is the thought of that like already turning your stomach? Are you struggling to get something in? The other question, what kind of workout are you doing? If it's short and easy, it's early in the morning, you could probably get away with a fasted run and maybe take some water or whatever and include, a carb containing snack the night before, right? Or in that case, if you ate dinner, let's say you ate a really early dinner, like 5 or 6, you would definitely want to have an evening snack. If you're eating dinner like 8:30 or 7:30 even, and you're going to bed early and you're running really early, maybe you don't need to have an extra snack. So again, it really kind of depends on what your schedule is and what you're doing. I think the other thing to keep in mind, how do you feel when you run fasted versus with a snack? And that's like with the easy run. Some people just feel better, perform better, even with those really easy, shorter runs when they have something in their stomach. Maybe it's because they're used to it or they just prefer it or whatever. I'm definitely one of those people. As I said, what time is your dinner? And so just lots of things to kind of ask yourself there. But some thoughts. If you're active, all of your meals and snacks should contain some form of carbohydrate. So yes, your evening snack or your dinner or your morning, whatever it is, they should all have carbohydrates, okay? Everything should have carbohydrates. So I'm not sure what exactly you mean by carb up. I'll interpret that to mean include carbs, and my answer is yes, always yes. If you're an athlete, if you exercise, you need carbs. So include all the carbs. Yes, yes, yes. All right, this next one, I guess it is nutrition related. Pixie Deli and Aptos, superb breakfast burritos. Have you tried it? No, I haven't. I'm putting that on my list. I am really missing good food for sure out here. Oh my God, I'm like dreaming of all of the New York City amazing food spots that I haven't been to in over a year. So yeah, always appreciate food recommendations if anyone has them for this part of California. Next up, nutrition for teens. And I got a second question, ideas to improve a teen's overall diet nutrition. So I hear that many of you have teenagers. So this is a huge topic. I've actually done a whole podcast on fueling young athletes with a colleague of mine. It's episode number 7, so definitely a throwback, but you can check that out for sure as we cover a lot in there. But just real quick, I mean, food in teens is, of course, so tough, and everyone has different struggles. So whether it's poor diet quality, not eating enough, or eating too much, poor body image, eating disorder concerns, or whatever else, there is just so much going on in this age group. So I can't possibly answer this in a quick way. So I just say that I hear you. I know it's really hard. I support you. I'm going through my own version of this with my toddler. Every age group has its challenges for sure. But I would say don't pressure. All you can do is offer, much like with younger kids, right? All you can do is offer a variety of healthy choices, and equally allow your kids to be kids and enjoy all foods. Just like how I approach food with adults, like with the teenagers I work with, like there really shouldn't be any foods that are off limits unless it's for medical allergy or allergy reasons, So, keep that in mind. Like all foods should be available. We don't want to put anything on a pedestal, but equally we should make sure that, teenagers, especially active teenagers are eating consistently. They're not skipping meals. They're hydrating. They're having some, relative balance to what they're eating, but equally letting them be kids and just go off and eat junk, like that's just part of it, right? And lastly, and I know this is hard, but try to avoid infusing your own food hangups or any other food relationship issues you have into the equation. That's a key one too. I will leave it at that. All right, next up, another huge topic. My goodness, you guys threw some big ones at me. Best electrolyte beverages. So confused. Thank you. So first off, I would say when it comes to best, that is all individual preference. So I never really say which anything is the best, right? Because that really depends on who you ask and what it's for. What I think is the best for me is different than what's the best for you. And someone, like I personally love Tailwind. I have clients who absolutely hate Tailwind, and that's fine. It doesn't matter, right? So I love that product. I only use it in specific situations. It just doesn't work for everybody. Some love Noon or Scratch or Morton or whatever else, right? There are a billion products out there. I will say I have a great hydration and electrolyte guest coming up really soon, so hang tight for that one, as we'll be covering a lot on hydration and electrolyte replenishment and all that good stuff. I can also link to a colleague of mine put out there's a sheet she made on all these different products and what they're used for and et cetera. So I can link to that in the show notes. I thought that was a really good graph or little image that she made. But yeah, all I'll say is, fluid and electrolyte needs are incredibly individual. And the ranges just for like sodium losses and sweat are massive from one person to the next. And even the fluids that you lose, there's a huge, huge range. And you also really have to consider what exactly you're doing, right? So those are like the two big things we're considering when we're determining what type of electrolyte drink you're having, if any at all, right? So are you running a few miles outside, or are you training for a marathon or ultra marathon or other endurance event and doing something really long? Are you exercising in a cooler climate or in the heat? Are you at high altitude or at sea level? Are you taking in other sports nutrition products and foods or just a sports drink? right? Is the product for preloading or during a workout or after a workout? So there are just lots of different situations that determine different needs on top of your own individual needs. So I know that's a really confusing answer and probably doesn't answer your question, but I just need to throw that out there. This is why it's a little bit of a tough one to answer, right? I will say, generally speaking, if you're a heavy sweater, like a really heavy sweater producing more than, let's say, like more than 1.2 liters an hour of fluid, you will likely need fluid and electrolytes on all workouts to replenish your losses, right? Versus if you're not really sweating very much or you're not a swelty sweater, let's say you go for an easy run, like you're fine with just water or even nothing, right? And whether or not you require calories as well depends on the workout. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And lastly, before I close this one up, don't forget that we can get electrolytes from food. So again, depending on what the situation is, we may not even need to turn to beverages based on, what's going on. So, all right. I know I didn't really answer your question fully, so please sit tight for an upcoming podcast with a hydration expert. All right, next up. I have a long run scheduled for Saturday. How far in advance should I be eating to fuel that run? Well, if you're running long, that means you're likely training for something long, right? And that should always be thinking about the bigger fueling picture. So we can't just look at that long run in a vacuum. We have to consider, like, what does the whole week look like? What are multiple weeks looking like? Are you eating consistently? Are you fueling all of your runs and recovering as well from them? Are you eating enough in total, both micro and macro levels? So, and then we can kind of zoom in a little bit more for the long run, because yes, of course, we want to be thinking about the day before and the morning of and what you're doing during, what you're doing after, and all those things. But I just had to point out first that we have to be looking at the bigger picture. And making sure that day to day you're doing enough and you're meeting your nutrition needs. Now, for just one long run, and it's not like the event, but I like to focus on the day before. So I think it's a good chance to practice what you plan to do before the event. So what is the breakfast that you plan to eat that morning of? And the night before, like, what's the dinner you plan to eat? Maybe you could try a few things so that you can have options and be flexible. What kind of situation is the event going to be in? Are you going to be cooking for yourself or out to a restaurant or whatever? So, these are all things we can start to think about and practice and play around with different foods and products and such, right? But again, we really want to be thinking about the bigger picture and making sure we're fueling enough, because if you get consistently under fueling on the whole or not meeting certain other needs, that will of course perfect your performance on that specific run. It's not just about what you're doing the day before. I mean, that too will affect your run. So thinking about both of those things. Next up, we're almost done here. Is sodium absorbed differently, especially time-wise, if it's sprinkled on food versus part of the food, for instance, deli meat, or as a hydration drink? That's a good question. To be honest, I don't really know if there are like significant or really noticeable differences in absorption with sodium specifically. Obviously, there are differences in absorption with just like a fluid with calories and carbs versus a food, let's say. But I guess another question is, are you drinking the same amount of water with the food you're eating compared to the hydration drink? Because if this question is related to, say, rehydrating post-exercise, we obviously want to be getting in calories, fluids, and salts. And salt is a key part of what we lose in sweat. We lose in the greatest amount. And it's also key to absorbing and retaining fluid in our blood. So we do need it to fully rehydrate. So let's say you're eating the same amount of sodium in food, but drinking less water. That's, of course, not ideal. Then again, we wouldn't want you only drinking a sports drink. Eventually, we'd want you to get in some real food. So I think the better question to ask is, are you hungry? Can you eat, or do you need quick, easy calories from a sports drink, for instance? Are you exercising, or is this, for after exercise? If it's for during sport, like, I mean, obviously, I'm assuming you're not like chomping on deli meats during your run, although maybe if it's an ultra, you're having a turkey sandwich. I mean, who knows? But, if it's during, maybe a sports drink or pretzels or whatever, I mean, that's all fine. It's what you tolerate, right? That's what's important. And if after, we want protein and other things. So I guess I was slightly confused about this question / maybe I need to, look back on my nutritional biochemistry and the mechanisms of action for sodium absorption, or maybe I should know this, right? But yeah, I think the better question, or the better way to think about it is more about what is the context, what do you need, how can we reach your goals, right? Yeah, okay, I'll leave it at that before I say something stupid. All right, lastly, fueling for running while pregnant or postpartum. This is another huge topic. I can't fully answer this entirely. I will say we do need more calories, of course, later in pregnancy, as well as more fluids, more iron, more protein, folate, other things, right? So we do need to keep this in mind, and even more so if our energy expenditure is increased due to running. If you're postpartum, if you're breastfeeding, we want to keep your supply up. I experienced this myself. I started running. I really wasn't on top of my nutrition. Go figure. My supply tanked. Not good. Tried to eat more, drink more fluids, eat enough carbs, all that good stuff, right? So, we really do want to be mindful of your nutrition if you're running, and breastfeeding, making sure you're getting in enough total energy, getting in the carbs, getting in lots of fluids and all of that, right? But fueling for pregnant or postpartum, I wouldn't say it's necessarily all that different than just other nutrition recommendations for pregnancy and postpartum states. But, the real thing is obviously you are burning more energy. You have even higher protein needs, depending on how much running you're doing, of course. And you're losing more fluid. And we need all those things. Those are really important when you're creating a human or taking care of a human being, right? So everything becomes even more important and more heightened. Okay. All right. That covers it for today. If you have more questions for me, please always feel free to email them to me at, eatforendurance@gmail.com. You can send me a DM on Instagram, which I've been totally, Instagram. I haven't posted on there since, I think, end of May. I don't know. It just hasn't felt right to me. I've posted on stories though, but haven't really been feeling the social media lately, gotta say. But I do check it, so feel free to send me a DM on there. I'm obviously checking that. And yeah, reach out anytime. As I said, I do finally have some guests lined up. I'm gonna hopefully be lining up someone from Precision Hydration, actually, the owner of Precision Hydration. That'll be a fun chat. And I have hopefully another ultra runner. I am an endurance cyclist I'm interviewing. That's coming up at some point, date TBD, as well as another RD interview, a sports dietitian, and we'll cover some fun topics, I'm sure. So I'm working on some other guests. If you guys want to intro me to anyone, I will take it. I have been struggling a little bit with I've been sending out a lot of cold emails and direct messages without response. I'll be fully honest with you guys. Normally I get a lot of intros, and that's how I get some great guests, or just through luck or whatever. But I've been struggling a little bit to get some guests lately. So you want to help a girl out, please go for it. All right, that's about it for today. You guys are great, and I appreciate the support as always. If you haven't already rated and reviewed the show, please do. And thanks for listening. Until next time, bye.